Hey, good evening, everybody. It is Friday, the 23rd of February at 8:16 p.m. Central Standard Time. Just wanted to get out here briefly and to continue talking about David. Yesterday we left off with the fact that David had went out and had answered the challenge of Goliath. Goliath, of course, defying the Israelites, and so the thing was that Saul and the rest of Israel were afraid, and 1 Samuel 17 and 24 basically says that based on the challenge that Goliath had made, that the men of Israel had fled. Well, David, with his 5 smooth stones, went out and he conquered Goliath. The thing after that, though, was that because of what had happened, David gained popularity. As we said before, that when Samuel anointed David, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David, but a distressing spirit went upon Saul. So the thing is that in the 18th chapter of 1 Samuel, we begin to understand that Saul has now got some resentment because David has been ascribed as killing 10,000 and Saul only 1,000, and so there was a serious there was a real serious resentment. And it was because of this resentment that Saul actually tossed a spear at David, trying to pin him up against the tent wall. David had to flee. David had to flee, but because of all of this, what ended up happening was that Saul continued constantly to persecute David, but because of David's fighting prowess, Saul had really no fighting prowess, and if we really wanted to be honest about it, because of the favor of the Lord, David ended up being Saul's primary commander as far as the armies were concerned. So as a result of him beating Goliath, one of the things that happened, David had actually wanted to fight, before he actually went and engaged in combat with Goliath wanted to know what it was that was being offered as far as some kind of reward or bounty. And so the thing is that Saul had actually promised that whoever defeated Goliath would be able to marry his daughter, Michal, and so therefore become a part of the royal family. Well, like I said, Saul continued to persecute David after he defeated Goliath, but the thing that came out of that was the fact that David actually became close friends with Saul's son Jonathan. Matter of fact, Jonathan gave David his clothes and his armor. So as we continue on through the story of David, we find out that while David was fleeing, that one of the things that he did was he went into the temple and he actually ate the holy bread. But because of his fighting prowess and who he was and the favor of God upon him, David was able to attract 400 very talented warriors to work with him. So as he continued on, one of the things that happens is that David ended up having to flee, and he would go from city to city, and eventually he ended up getting to the place where he actually had to live amongst the Philistines in order to survive. But there were a couple of other things that happened during this process, because the thing is that David had a couple of opportunities in which he could actually have taken Saul's life, but because of who David was and understanding that Saul had been anointed by God, David spared his life not once but twice. So we just wanted to keep going with that because of the fact that people need to understand that this David was David, as far as being chosen by God, led a life of intrigue, and there were a lot of things that happened. Like some of us, we have a lot of things that go on, some of them good, some of them bad. But the thing is that we have to keep on going. And David, because of the fact that he had been anointed by Samuel, continued to keep on striving and to keep on going. David eventually then goes and he allies himself with the Philistines, and and aligning himself with the Philistines, he goes and he hides amongst them in order to stay away from Saul. Well, as a part of everything that's going on, what ends up happening is that later on, that the Philistines were gathering again for war. And so Saul wanted to know what was going to happen, because again, you have to remember that he had lost favor. So he went and he consulted a medium. So as we continue on with this, when the Philistines arrayed themselves in battle against the Israelites, they determined that it was quite possible that David was going to turn against them, even though he had been living amongst them. What they did was they decided that David could not go to war with them. So as they go to war, and they fight, and what ends up happening is that Saul and his sons get killed in the battle. And that is where David actually becomes the king. There was the report of Saul's death, and what ended up happening was that a young man came and told David about Saul's death, and the young man embellished the story and said that he had helped and assisted Saul in killing himself. So the thing is that what ends up happening after that, of course, is that David is anointed the king of Judah, and Saul's son, Saul's son Ishibosheth was then made the king of Israel. So Israel and Judah have this war, and you have to remember that the Bible says that David served as king of Hebron for 7 years and 33 years for all of Israel. So one of the things that happens after that, of course, is that after this battle, Abner joins forces with David, and Joab is afraid that comes to the conclusion that Abner is actually spying on David, trying to figure out what his weaknesses are. So Joab murders Abner. So as we continue on with this thing, David reigns over all of Israel, and then what happens with that, of course, is that then David then conquers Jerusalem. So as we continue on, what ends up happening then after that is that after David conquers Jerusalem, then he brings the ark of the covenant to Jerusalem. God makes a covenant with David and tells David that he will not lack for someone to sit on the throne. So as we continue on, David goes and David has many more battles, many more conquests. One of the things that happens during David's life is, I failed to mention it before, because David married Abigail based on the fact that he had actually been taking care of looking out for Abigail's husband Nabal's fields, and then wanted to get some food for compensation, and the guy didn't want to give him anything. Abigail came out and met David, gave him some additional food, gave him and his men food and what have you, and David ends up eventually marrying Abigail. So the thing is that, and this is where we're going to leave off today, because of the fact that we need to just kind of break this thing down into pieces. So David now is king of all of Israel, and David happens to go out in the middle of the day, and Bathsheba is on the roof taking a bath. David spies her from his rooftop and sends for her. When he sends for her, then what David does is then David lays with her, and she becomes pregnant. Bathsheba's husband was named Uriah, and Uriah was one of David's 30 mighty men. And so David, in order to cover up his sin, decided that he was going to have Uriah sent to the front lines. First off, David, trying to cover it up, he tries to get Uriah to go home to his wife and lay with her in order to cover up the fact that she's with child. Uriah declines to do that because he says that it would be less honorable for him to be at home comfortable when his comrades were out fighting. So David then made the decision that he was going to have Uriah sent to the front lines. Of course, Uriah was sent to the front lines and he was killed. So David was then able to cover up that sin. The first, and of course, Bathsheba had the child, and that child died. David, when found out that the child was sick, David was fasting and praying and what have you. And then when the child died, David then washed himself up, and he ate. And that's where we're going to hang it up for today. We'll be back at this again tomorrow to finish up the rest of the story of David, so that we can actually then look at Judas and then talk about the different and various types of betrayal. May God bless and keep you, and you have a great evening.